Today, we delve into the case of the Belize Phantom, one of the most chilling crimes ever to unfold in this small Central American nation. In the narrow streets of the town, darkness did more than conceal solitude. Hid a cold, calculating figure who struck without warning. Young women began to vanish under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only scattered clues and unanswered questions. The police struggled to make sense of the evidence, while residents lived in constant fear, and homes that once felt safe now seemed shadowed by unease. Who was behind these disappearances? What drove this person to act with such calculated cruelty? And would the truth ever come to light? Step into the story and uncover the haunting details behind this unsettling case. The cases took place in Belize, a small country in Central America, bordering Mexico to the north and Guatemala to the west and south. Belize is known for its stunning natural beauty, vast tropical forests, winding rivers and lakes, white sandy beaches, and peaceful small towns with modest homes and tin roofs. The town where the incidents occurred, once familiar and close-knit, suddenly felt alien as fear began to creep in. Narrow, quiet streets, and the paths that wove through the surrounding jungle, once places where children played freely, turned into shadowed areas, fraught with unseen danger. Residents became reluctant to step outside after nightfall. By day, the laughter of children and the sounds of local markets continued, giving a false sense of security. But as darkness fell, every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the distant barking of dogs, or the wind brushing through the trees became unsettling, signaling that something was amiss. The timeline of the crimes was set in 1999, the late 1990s, a period when Belize was undergoing significant social and economic changes. The nation still faced many limitations in infrastructure and public services, and the police force was constrained by both manpower and resources. This made investigating complex cases extremely challenging. Officers were required to patrol deserted streets at night, navigate winding jungle trails, and carefully gather fragile evidence from crime scenes. Every detail, from faint tracks on the ground to witness accounts within the community, had to be painstakingly examined, often hindered by limited resources and mounting pressure from an anxious public. The social context of the time further amplified the fear. Most residents relied on agriculture, fishing, or small-scale tourism for their livelihoods, and life was closely tied to community relationships. This closeness, while usually a strength, meant that news of the crimes spread quickly. Rumors, newspapers, and radio were the primary means of communication, but they often lacked details, leaving the community both curious and fearful. With each passing day, unease deepened. Parents tightened supervision of their children. Children avoided going out alone. Adults minimized nighttime activities. Homes that once felt safe became refuges, while narrow streets that had been routine pathways now seemed like mysterious mazes, where any step could be met with hidden danger. Flickering streetlights on wet sidewalks, rustling sounds from the nearby jungle, and mist curling around dirt roads combined to create an atmosphere of persistent dread, leaving the community in a state of constant tension. The fear extended beyond individual anxiety. The townspeople began to realize that their once peaceful community was now overshadowed by something incomprehensible and dangerous. Every small detail, a discarded chair by the roadside, a dog's sudden howl, an unusual light in the distance, became significant, reinforcing the sense of suspense and unease. It was precisely this setting, stunning but perilous nature, a close-knit community now living in fear, an under-resourced police force, and weak media coverage that created a fertile environment for the horrifying crimes to occur and left lasting psychological scars on the residents. The series of crimes was first noticed by the police as a string of mysterious and seemingly disconnected events, yet there was an undeniable thread connecting them, one that filled the community with growing dread. The victims were primarily young women and children, members of a once peaceful town, unsuspecting of the horrors that would soon intrude into their lives. As the first cases were documented, investigators quickly recognized that these were not isolated incidents. Each crime scene appeared to carry hints of a calculated, hidden pattern, suggesting the presence of a perpetrator who planned and executed each act with chilling precision. Most of the crime scenes were situated in remote and rarely frequented areas, along overgrown jungle paths, on quiet dirt roads looping around the outskirts of the town, or near dense forests where visibility was limited. By daylight, these locations appeared ordinary and even serene, but at night they transformed into shadowed and threatening spaces, where even the faintest sound, rustling leaves, distant dog barks, or the sway of tree branches could trigger a surge of fear. Fog often clung to the ground, and the flickering streetlights cast inconsistent pools of light, turning familiar surroundings into a maze of uncertainty and unease. At each site, the clues were sparse and subtle, requiring investigators to meticulously scrutinize every detail. A discarded item, a backpack left carelessly by the side of a path, a pair of shoes out of place, or faint footprints in damp earth, became the only threads connecting the perpetrator to the crime. Even these minute traces were difficult to interpret. The temporal gaps between incidents, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, further complicated efforts to identify patterns or predict the perpetrator's next move. Police officers were challenged not only to collect evidence but also to construct a psychological profile from fragments that offered more questions than answers. The impact on the community was immediate and profound. Fear became a constant companion. Parents kept their children indoors. Children no longer dared to play freely outside, and adults avoided walking alone after sunset. Every unfamiliar sound, every shadow moving just beyond the light, heightened the sense that danger lurked nearby. The town, once defined by its tranquility and routine, now existed in a state of heightened vigilance and collective anxiety. The police worked tirelessly, navigating deserted streets and dense jungle trails, cross-referencing witness statements, and attempting to connect the faintest dots of evidence across multiple crime scenes. Every discovery, no matter how minor, brought a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that the case could be solved, fear that the perpetrator might still be watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The sense of a hidden, calculating presence created an atmosphere of suspense and tension that gripped the town day and night. The interplay between shadowy crime scenes, elusive clues, and a community living in constant fear transformed the investigation into a saga that was frightening not only to the police but to everyone who called the town home. Streets that had once felt familiar now seemed unpredictable and dangerous. The fear was amplified by the subtle details: a chair left abandoned along a path, a dog's sudden howl in the night, a flickering light from deep within the jungle. Every detail became significant, every anomaly a potential signal of unseen menace. It was precisely this combination of limited evidence, secluded locations, and psychological tension that made the Belize Phantom case so haunting and unforgettable, casting a long shadow over the town long after the initial discoveries. One of the most unsettling aspects of this series of crimes was the timing of the attacks. The victims were frequently targeted at night, when the town was cloaked in darkness, streets were eerily silent, and the only sounds came from the wind rustling through the trees, the soft whisper of leaves, or the echo of footsteps across deserted pathways. This choice of timing was deliberate, revealing a perpetrator who understood the routines and habits of the community, someone who knew exactly how to exploit the cover of night to act without detection. Night, which should have been a period of rest and safety, instead became a tense, anxiety-filled stretch of hours, where every sound and every shadow might signal imminent danger. Families began to lock doors earlier than usual, children were kept indoors, and even the simplest nightly stroll became an exercise in fear. With hearts racing at every distant noise, the crimes also displayed the meticulous planning and calculated behavior of the perpetrator. Each crime scene seemed carefully chosen, isolated areas rarely frequented by people, jungle-adjacent paths, and dimly lit corners where evidence could be obscured or erased with ease. There appeared to be a method to the spacing and timing between incidents, forming a sequence that was simultaneously disconnected and yet disturbingly interconnected. This made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to establish a behavioral pattern. Every small clue left behind, a discarded backpack, a lone shoe, or faint footprints in the damp earth, was deliberate, a subtle signature of someone manipulating the situation to maximize pressure on both police and the community. The perpetrator seemed to understand exactly how to create uncertainty, prolong fear, and remain invisible while instilling a pervasive sense of dread. Some crime scenes included disturbing signs indicating the victims had been assaulted prior to death. While the details were never explicitly described in public reports, the implications alone were enough to shock investigators and residents alike. The realization that these acts were deliberate and premeditated deepened the community's sense of vulnerability. A town that had once felt secure suddenly became a place where every shadow seemed threatening. Flickering streetlights, the rustling of underbrush, and distant, unexplained noises transformed familiar streets and trails into foreboding spaces. Residents began interpreting ordinary nighttime occurrences as potential threats, heightening the psychological impact of the crimes and embedding fear into daily routines. The combination of nighttime attacks, careful planning, and eerie evidence created a climate of terror throughout the town. Police officers worked around the clock, meticulously analyzing the smallest details, attempting to connect disparate clues, and constructing profiles of a criminal who seemed always a step ahead. Meanwhile, the public lived in a constant state of alertness. Parents monitored every movement of their children, residents avoided walking alone after dark, and ordinary activities going to the market, returning from work, or taking an evening walk became fraught with anxiety. Each new report, each new clue discovered at a crime scene reinforced the chilling awareness that the perpetrator remained at large, calculating, and observing. Fear became inseparable from daily life, a shadow that lingered in every corner and every quiet street. These crimes were far from isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of calculated horror, where cold intelligence, cruelty, and darkness intertwined. The perpetrator was not only violent but methodical, turning a once familiar and peaceful town into a place where normalcy and danger coexisted uncomfortably. Law enforcement recognized that they were facing a highly intelligent, remorseless offender, and the community understood that their prior sense of security had been shattered. The pervasive tension, the persistent uncertainty, and the unrelenting fear left a lasting mark on the town, creating an atmosphere of dread that no one could easily escape or forget. From the very moment the first crimes came to light, the local community was gripped by immediate and intense fear. Residents began drastically limiting their movements after dark, particularly women and children, the most vulnerable in the town. Parents, once trusting in the safety of their streets and neighborhoods, now watched their children with unrelenting vigilance. Children who had previously roamed freely and played outside were restricted to the confines of their homes or forced to move only under adult supervision. Teenagers, once carefree and social, hesitated to gather outdoors, and even routine trips to markets or neighbors' houses were approached with caution. The town, once alive with familiar sounds, the chatter of vendors, laughter of children, and the hum of daily activity, fell into an unnatural silence once the sun dipped below the horizon. Every footstep, every creak of a door, every rustle from nearby foliage seemed amplified, echoing ominously across the empty streets and alleyways. Fear was contagious, spreading quickly beyond the immediate families affected. Ordinary everyday occurrences took on menacing significance. Shadows that once seemed harmless now appeared threatening. The flicker of a streetlight became a signal of unseen presence, and the slightest sound, wind whistling through trees, leaves brushing against windows, or distant footsteps could provoke panic. Rumors circulated faster than official reports, amplified by sparse media coverage and whispers in local markets or community gatherings. The uncertainty created a heightened state of alert. No one trusted the familiar anymore. Every passerby, every stranger, every unexplained movement became a potential harbinger of danger. At the same time, the police faced extraordinary pressure. Investigators worked around the clock, meticulously combing streets, alleyways, and jungle trails near the town, examining each crime scene with painstaking care. They documented every discarded object, analyzed the faintest footprints in the dirt, and recorded the minutest details from witness testimonies. Each scene presented its own puzzle, fragmented clues, scattered items, and the absence of clear connections to suspects made building a coherent profile extremely difficult. With the perpetrator remaining unidentified, officers were pushed to the limit, working through long nights, often exhausted yet compelled to continue under the scrutiny of the community, victims' families, and local authorities. The psychological impact on the town was equally significant. Fear penetrated every corner of life. Doors were bolted early, families stayed indoors, and children and adults alike navigated their daily routines with heightened caution. The town's once safe streets and paths were now perceived as perilous, where even a familiar route could harbor unseen threats. Anxiety became a constant companion, subtly influencing behavior, decisions, and social interactions. People began observing each other, suspicious of strangers, and cautious even of familiar faces. Furthermore, each new development in the case only intensified the dread. Every report of a crime scene, every discovery of a new clue, reinforced the sense that the perpetrator was always watching, calculating, and poised to strike again. Fear and curiosity intertwined, leaving residents in a state of persistent vigilance, aware, alert, yet uncertain of when or where the next attack might occur. This prolonged climate of anxiety established the atmosphere of terror that would define the Belize Phantom case. The crimes were no longer merely acts of violence, they became a shadow over the entire community. infiltrating homes, streets, and daily life. Nights that were once peaceful now carried an undercurrent of dread, a reminder that danger lurked in the darkness, unseen but ever present. The psychological toll on the town was immense, leaving a lingering fear that would continue to shape the community long after the initial incidents, marking the case as one of the most haunting and pervasive threats in Belize's recent history. As the first crimes emerged, the Belizean police immediately launched a full-scale investigation, determined to identify the perpetrator before more lives were lost. Yet, from the outset, it was clear that this case would be far from ordinary. The crimes had been carried out with chilling precision, often in isolated, dimly lit areas at night. Evidence was sparse, subtle, and easily lost in the dense foliage or under layers of soil, making the job of gathering clues both physically demanding and psychologically draining. The crime scene analysis was the foundation of the investigation. Officers meticulously examined every inch of the scene: footprints, discarded personal items, the precise placement of the victim's body, marks on vegetation, and traces that might indicate a struggle. Each scene was photographed, carefully mapped, and scrutinized for any detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed: a torn piece of fabric, a crushed flower, a faint scratch on the ground. Even the angle at which the victim fell could hold a clue. Conditions were rarely ideal. Officers often worked deep in thick jungle or on remote dirt paths, at night, and in harsh weather: rain, wind, fog, or oppressive humidity. Every movement had to be calculated to avoid contaminating evidence, while simultaneously remaining vigilant against the natural dangers of the environment: sudden animal noises, shifting shadows, slippery terrain, or unstable trees. Interviewing witnesses and engaging with the community was equally crucial. Though fraught with challenges, officers approached residents living near crime scenes, seeking any information about unusual activity, strangers in the area, or suspicious behavior after dark. Many locals were hesitant or outright refused to speak, fearing retaliation or believing the perpetrator was always watching. Others shared rumors, half-truths, or distorted recollections, forcing investigators to carefully cross-check each detail against physical evidence and other testimonies. Compiling and comparing statements from multiple sources, verifying time, location, and reported behavior, required painstaking effort and consumed countless hours. The pervasive fear within the community intensified the pressure on officers, making it extremely difficult to separate fact from speculation. To supplement traditional investigative work, modern forensic techniques were employed whenever possible: fingerprint analysis, trace evidence examination, forensic physics, and other scientific approaches were applied to uncover links between seemingly unrelated cases. Investigators also studied patterns of behavior to understand the perpetrator's habits, routines, and possible psychological profile. Despite these efforts, Belize's limited technology and resources hampered progress. Many clues, though carefully collected, could not be immediately connected to suspects, and officers often had to repeat examinations, measurements, and analyses, sometimes multiple times. In an exhausting cycle that offered no guarantee of results, the investigation quickly became more than a technical exercise. It was a tense battle against time, skill, and cunning. Each new crime scene was like a puzzle, every witness statement a potential breakthrough or dead end. Investigators worked tirelessly, often for days without rest, under the combined pressures of public scrutiny, community fear, and the constant threat of additional attacks. The perpetrator's meticulous methods and the complexity of the crimes created a chilling sense of unease, as if an unseen presence was always observing, calculating, and staying just one step ahead. Even the smallest discovery carried enormous weight. A faint footprint could redirect an entire line of inquiry. A discarded object could point to connections previously overlooked. Yet with every minor breakthrough came frustration: clues could vanish, witnesses could retract statements, and environmental conditions could erase what little evidence remained. The police faced the dual burden of piecing together an increasingly complex pattern while reassuring a terrified community that safety was possible in the town itself. Fear grew in tandem with the investigation. Streets once considered safe became shadowed and threatening. Residents avoided walking alone, especially after dark, and even familiar neighbors and paths were treated with suspicion. The town's everyday rhythm was disrupted. Anxiety became a constant companion for everyone. This blend of meticulous police work, community terror, and the unseen threat of a calculating killer created an atmosphere of pervasive dread, where tension and suspense were felt in every corner of the investigation. Ultimately, the investigation was a test of endurance, skill, and resolve. The police were constantly balancing the need for careful, methodical evidence collection with the urgency to prevent further crimes. Each scene, each clue, each witness interaction demanded precision, patience, and an unwavering attention to detail. The perpetrator remained elusive, always somewhere out of sight, his presence haunting both the investigators and the community. The investigation became more than a search for a criminal. It was a high-stakes struggle against fear itself, with every hour and every decision carrying profound consequences. As the series of attacks continued, Belizean law enforcement moved quickly to construct a comprehensive list of potential suspects, understanding that any delay could cost more lives. The process was painstaking and fraught with challenges. Investigators combed through witness statements, analyzed behavioral patterns, and meticulously studied the connections between victims and people in their social circles. They also reviewed local reports of suspicious individuals, anyone seen lingering near secluded paths, jungle trails, or the narrow streets close to the crime scenes during the late hours when the attacks occurred. Among the early suspects were individuals with prior criminal records, people known to have engaged in violent or predatory behavior, or those with some form of association with previous victims. Others had no criminal history but were linked to the locations or had been noticed in the vicinity at suspicious times. The result was a long and complex roster of potential perpetrators, each requiring careful scrutiny and continuous monitoring. Every detail and unexplained absence, an inconsistent statement, or a peculiar pattern in daily habits was noted and cross-referenced. Despite the growing list, the investigators faced the daunting challenge of insufficient evidence. The crimes were executed with remarkable precision. The killer's movements were calculated, deliberate, and eerily strategic, leaving almost no physical evidence that could directly connect a suspect to the murders. Many had solid alibis or statements consistent with the limited information available, making formal charges impossible. Every piece of potential evidence had to be evaluated against a backdrop of uncertainty, with the understanding that one misstep could let the perpetrator continue their spree. Investigators had to treat even the smallest trace, a scuffed shoeprint, a disturbed bush, a forgotten personal item as potentially critical, knowing that the killer's intelligence and patience made him unpredictable and dangerous. The psychological strain on the police was immense. Officers worked long hours, often through the night, following leads, monitoring suspects, analyzing minor traces, and trying to identify behavioral patterns. The relentless pressure and the fear that the next attack could occur at any moment weighed heavily on every member of the investigative team. Fatigue, stress, and the burden of responsibility created a tense, almost oppressive atmosphere within the police department. The broader community also felt the invisible grip of fear. The inability to identify the perpetrator spread anxiety throughout the town. Ordinary daily activities became sources of stress. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unattended. Women avoided walking alone, and even men moved cautiously, aware that the next attack could strike at any moment. Familiar streets, jungle paths, and even neighbors' houses were viewed with suspicion. The town's once familiar rhythms were replaced by heightened vigilance, as residents learned to interpret every shadow, every rustle of leaves, and every flicker of light as a potential threat. Adding to the tension was the sense of an unseen presence, as though the killer could be watching from just beyond sight. This invisible threat created a psychological burden that compounded the tangible danger. Police knew that any one of the suspects could be the culprit, yet no definitive proof existed. Residents shared this sense of dread, perceiving that the predator might be hidden nearby, observing, calculating, and ready to strike. The atmosphere in the town was suffused with suspicion, mistrust, and unease, making fear an inescapable part of daily life. Every step of the investigation was a high-stakes endeavor. The police had to meticulously verify each lead, balance the urgency of the investigation with procedural caution, and attempt to predict the killer's next move. Each clue, no matter how small, carried the potential to unlock the mystery or mislead the investigation entirely. Meanwhile, the community remained in a state of continuous anxiety, understanding that the predator had already disrupted the normalcy of their lives, and that peace was still elusive. This combination of a long and complex suspect list, the meticulous work required to pursue leads, the killer's sophisticated methods, and the widespread fear created a tense, almost suffocating environment. The town, once tranquil, was now overshadowed by the presence of an unknown and calculating threat. a chilling reminder that the perpetrator remained free and possibly watching, waiting for the next opportunity. The psychological impact of not knowing who was responsible or when the next attack might occur was a powerful, ever-present force, shaping both the investigation and the lives of every person in the community. From the very first reports, the Belizean police found themselves in a race against time, fear, and the cunning of an unknown perpetrator. The victims, mostly young women and children, vanished under mysterious and brutal circumstances, plunging the small town into a pervasive state of terror. The town, once quiet and familiar, became a landscape of suspicion and unease, where every shadow, every flicker of light, and every distant sound could signal danger. Officers immediately launched a comprehensive investigation, but every step required extraordinary attention to detail, patience, and strategic thinking. Crime scene analysis was both critical and grueling. Officers examined every minute detail, the position of bodies, the orientation and arrangement of the crime scene, objects abandoned or displaced, footprints, scratch marks on nearby trees, broken branches, or scuffed leaves, all potential clues in understanding the perpetrator's movements. Each scene was meticulously photographed, mapped, and measured. Investigators painstakingly documented even the smallest elements, understanding that the tiniest trace, a discarded piece of clothing, a scuff on the ground, or a bent blade of grass could prove crucial. Yet the conditions were far from ideal. Most crime scenes were located in remote, forested areas or along isolated paths, often under the cover of night, heavy rain, or dense fog. Officers navigated slippery, uneven terrain, constantly aware that a single misstep could destroy vital evidence. Beyond the environmental hazards, there was the ever-present psychological pressure of knowing the perpetrator could still be nearby, watching, calculating, or even taunting them. Interviewing witnesses and the local community presented a second formidable challenge. Many residents were hesitant, if not outright fearful, to share what they had seen, worried that speaking out might draw the perpetrator's attention. Some provided only fragmented accounts, rumors, or hearsay, forcing investigators to sift through layers of unreliable information. The task of connecting these disparate threads, matching times, locations, suspicious behaviors, and potential links to victims, demanded extraordinary patience and analytical skill. Even a seemingly minor observation, such as a shadowy figure loitering near a house a few nights before a murder, could open a new investigative path, yet also risk sending the team into a labyrinth of false leads and dead ends. The Belizean police also relied on modern forensic techniques, attempting to bridge gaps in the investigation with science. Physical evidence collection, fingerprinting, DNA analysis, and other forensic methods were employed to identify connections between cases and reconstruct patterns of behavior. However, the limitations of technology and resources were stark. DNA samples often took weeks to process, and fingerprint matches could not be verified quickly against international databases. These delays magnified pressure on the investigative team, prolonging uncertainty and leaving the community in ongoing fear. Officers frequently had to repeat analyses, re-examine scenes, and double-check evidence, a grueling process that tested both endurance and mental fortitude. Suspect surveillance added yet another layer of complexity. The list of potential suspects slowly narrowed but remained inconclusive. Some individuals were seen near crime scenes or had connections to the victims, yet circumstantial evidence and unbroken alibis prevented definitive charges. Every suspect required constant monitoring. Every movement, every encounter, every detail had to be recorded and analyzed. Investigators worked around the clock, plotting patterns, cross-referencing accounts, and attempting to link traces that initially appeared insignificant. Exhaustion, stress, and the weight of responsibility became a constant companion for the officers, knowing that a single oversight could allow the perpetrator to strike again. Meanwhile, the community lived in a continuous state of fear and hypervigilance. Streets emptied after sunset. Even the faintest sounds, rustling leaves, a distant animal cry, or a flickering light triggered anxiety and suspicion. Parents closely monitored children, often keeping them indoors, while adults avoided traveling alone. This pervasive fear complicated investigations further. Witnesses were hesitant to provide information, and officers frequently had to rely on indirect reports or subtle behavioral cues. The psychological strain of working in this environment, coupled with the knowledge that the perpetrator remained at large, amplified the tension, creating a feedback loop of fear that affected both civilians and law enforcement. Despite exhaustive efforts, the perpetrator remained elusive. Each advancement in the investigation revealed an increasingly calculated pattern of behavior, suggesting intelligence, planning, and meticulous attention to detail. Clues that initially appeared promising often led to dead ends, heightening frustration, anxiety, and the sense of vulnerability. The combination of public pressure, widespread fear, and the perpetrator's sophistication created a dense, oppressive atmosphere. Both the police and the townspeople felt the intangible presence of a predator always just out of sight, silently observing, calculating, and instilling dread. The investigation evolved into a battle of intellect, patience, and psychological endurance, where every clue, every testimony, and every piece of physical evidence had to be dissected thoroughly. Officers balanced meticulous scientific analysis with human intuition, knowing that any mistake could cost another life. Meanwhile, the perpetrator roamed freely, leaving behind only traces and a chilling pattern, turning each step forward into a tense game of anticipation and strategy. The town existed under a shadow of fear, the police under unrelenting pressure, and the perpetrator became an invisible, omnipresent force, the embodiment of terror stalking the streets, forests, and alleys, shaping the lives of everyone in the small Belizean community. Despite the Belizean police launching a comprehensive, multi-layered investigation, combining detailed crime scene analysis, fingerprinting, DNA sampling, behavioral profiling, and extensive witness interviews, the perpetrator remained unidentified. Each crime appeared meticulously planned, executed with a high level of cunning, and followed a distinct signature pattern, which made it exceptionally difficult for investigators to link any suspect definitively to the offenses. While several individuals were monitored and investigated closely, most had solid alibis, non-contradictory statements, or circumstantial connections, leaving investigators without the hard evidence necessary to press formal charges. The process of connecting clues across different crime scenes was agonizingly slow. Many leads that initially appeared promising quickly ended in dead ends. Even minor details, a faint footprint in damp soil, a snapped branch on the forest edge, or a fleeting shadow seen by a terrified witness required painstaking verification, often involving multiple officers re-examining the scene, cross-checking witness testimonies, and comparing physical evidence against other incidents. Weeks turned into months, and months into years, yet progress remained incremental. This slow advancement, paired with the psychological toll of knowing the perpetrator was still at large, weighed heavily on the police, generating an atmosphere of constant tension and mental exhaustion. The complexity of the perpetrator's methods amplified these challenges. The choice of remote, dimly lit locations, often near forest paths or isolated areas around the town, demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the local environment and the daily routines of residents. Each act was carefully timed, suggesting a deliberate effort to evade detection while maintaining psychological control over the community. The recurring patterns hinted at a cold, calculating intelligence, a criminal mind that not only executed crimes efficiently but seemed to take subtle pleasure in testing the investigators, leaving misleading traces, or arranging objects to confuse and frustrate the authorities. The investigation's obstacles were further compounded by limitations in local resources. Belizean law enforcement, while determined, lacked sufficient personnel, forensic technology, and access to international databases. DNA samples could not be analyzed quickly, fingerprints often remained unmatched, and modern surveillance tools were sparse. Every step from mapping the scene to cross-referencing evidence across multiple incidents required manual, time-consuming labor, with officers often working long hours under mounting pressure. In addition, hostile or fearful witnesses, many afraid of retaliation, either withheld information or provided conflicting accounts, making it even more challenging to piece together a coherent timeline or identify credible leads. As the months passed without a breakthrough, community anxiety escalated. Streets once filled with children's laughter and social activity fell silent at night. Residents restricted their movements, parents kept children indoors, and even adults avoided traveling alone after dark. Every shadow, rustling leaf, or flickering streetlight became a source of fear, reinforcing the notion that the perpetrator could be watching from unseen corners, always present but invisible. The tension was palpable. It seeped into workplaces, schools, and homes, creating a community-wide climate of suspicion and paranoia for the investigators. The psychological burden was relentless. Each new clue required careful deliberation, as any misstep could compromise the investigation. Every potential lead had to be verified, cross-checked, and connected to other incidents. while simultaneously accounting for false trails deliberately or inadvertently left by the perpetrator. This relentless cycle of hope and frustration created a sense of mental fatigue and moral strain, as officers understood the human cost of delay while knowing the offender remained free to continue targeting victims. Despite these challenges, the investigation revealed certain insights into the perpetrator's behavior, though none were sufficient to secure an arrest. The offender displayed a pattern of preying on vulnerable individuals at night, choosing locations with minimal witnesses and optimal concealment. Evidence suggested careful planning and a strategic approach to leaving just enough clues to mislead without providing incriminating proof. Investigators began to appreciate that the perpetrator not only sought to commit crimes but to manipulate the investigative process itself, perhaps to instill fear, maintain dominance over the community, or psychologically torment the authorities. Ultimately, the case remained unsolved, leaving critical questions unanswered. The perpetrator's true motives, the complete number of victims, and potential future actions were all unknown. The community continued to live under the shadow of fear. Streets stayed eerily quiet after dusk, children remained indoors, and even the natural sounds of the forest whined through the leaves. Distant animal calls were interpreted as threats. The crime's lasting psychological impact extended beyond the victims, shaping the town's collective consciousness and instilling a heightened sense of vigilance and unease for law enforcement and criminologists alike. The case became a haunting example of meticulous, organized crime, demonstrating how a perpetrator with intelligence, patience, and strategic planning can operate with minimal direct evidence. It highlighted the fragility of investigative efforts when resources are limited and how community fear can both hinder and motivate law enforcement. The combination of intricate criminal logic, investigative limitations, and prolonged uncertainty transformed the Belize Phantom case into a chilling enigma, one that kept the town, the police, and the broader community in a state of enduring suspense, fear and anticipation, waiting for the day the shadowy figure might finally be brought to justice. The Belize Phantom case was not just a series of heinous crimes, it left deep and lasting effects, both socially and, to some extent, on a broader scale. As soon as the crimes were discovered, the local community was plunged into a profound state of fear, one that saturated every aspect of daily life. Streets that had once been lively and welcoming became eerily silent at night. Even the sound of footsteps seemed amplified, and the darkness felt thicker, almost oppressive, heightening an unshakable sense of unease. Children were no longer allowed to play outside, women moved cautiously when alone, and even strong, able-bodied men avoided venturing into forested areas or less traveled paths. Families implemented stringent safety measures, locking doors and windows with extra security, walking in groups after dark, setting up warning bells or motion-sensitive lights, and vigilantly monitoring any unusual activity around their homes. The fear was not limited to families directly affected by the crimes. It spread throughout the town and neighboring areas, creating a pervasive atmosphere of constant vigilance. Residents became hyper-aware of every sound, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the swaying of trees, the faint steps of someone unknown on a dim street. All could trigger immediate alarm. Each night became a psychological test, a tense ritual in which every shadow and every noise reminded them of the perpetrator's cunning and relentless presence. The crimes also exposed gaps in the local police and security system, highlighting shortages of personnel, limited investigative resources, and weaknesses in addressing serious offenses. This realization heightened public anxiety and sparked intense discussions about safety and the community's ability to protect itself. Residents became overly cautious and suspicious, scrutinizing the smallest unusual behaviors, from newcomers in the neighborhood to minor actions of neighbors. This tension was not fleeting. It lingered for months and created a lasting psychological strain, reshaping daily routines and instilling a culture of caution. At the same time, the situation compelled the community to strengthen bonds and take collective responsibility for protection. Spontaneous neighborhood watch groups formed, residents patrolled local streets, shared observations about suspicious behavior, and issued warnings whenever potential threats were noticed. Despite living under constant fear, the community developed a remarkable resilience, balancing everyday life with heightened alertness and adapting to the new, uncertain reality. Within this environment, every nighttime sound, every unfamiliar figure near a home, and every rustle from the surrounding forests became a haunting reminder of the perpetrator's presence and the possibility that he could strike suddenly. targeting the most vulnerable. Fear became intertwined with daily life, not only altering routines but also leaving a deep emotional and psychological mark. The town experienced a prolonged period of stress, anxiety, and collective trauma, a shadow that lingered over its residents long after the immediate threats were recognized. This heightened social tension demonstrated how a string of calculated crimes could reshape a community, instilling fear, altering behavior, and forcing people to develop new strategies for survival. The impact extended beyond personal safety. It changed how residents interacted with one another, how they perceived their environment, and how the community as a whole functioned in the aftermath of violence. Life, once ordinary and predictable, had been replaced by a state of perpetual vigilance, a haunting legacy of the Belize Phantom. The psychological effects of the Belize Phantom case extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the crimes, leaving invisible scars that lingered for years throughout the community. The chilling memory of the brutal incidents haunted residents, embedding itself deeply into their daily lives. Every unfamiliar shadow along the streets, every flicker of light in the night, every rustle in the surrounding forests could trigger a surge of fear and hype. Each night seemed to blanket the town in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, forcing people to adapt to a persistent sense of unease and never underestimate the potential dangers lurking around them. The pressure from public attention, combined with the fact that the perpetrator remained free and displayed a calculated, methodical approach, created a psychological shadow that permeated every aspect of daily life. Residents became guarded and suspicious, questioning one another's intentions and losing the sense of security they once took for granted. Social interactions diminished as families limited contact with neighbors, avoided nighttime outings, and adopted extreme protective measures. Children grew up in fear, women and the elderly lived in constant anxiety, and men assumed the heavy responsibility of protecting their families, all under a prolonged state of stress and tension. The case served as a grim reminder of the cunning and danger posed by such criminals, while simultaneously highlighting the limitations in local investigative capacity and community protection. Police, community members, and criminal researchers continued to scrutinize leftover clues, hoping that someday the truth would finally emerge. This ongoing psychological strain prompted changes in investigative methods, encouraged international cooperation, and increased public awareness of personal and communal safety. The lingering effects of the case created a subtle but profound kind of psychological phantom that remained present in everyday life. People not only lived with fear of the perpetrator's return but also carried a heightened awareness of potential, unpredictable threats. The case underscored the reality that cruelty, cunning, and unpredictability can exist even within seemingly peaceful communities, leaving a lasting imprint on the collective psyche of the town and shaping the behavior, routines, and interactions of its residents for years to come. Even long after the crimes, the community's vigilance remained heightened. Residents developed habits and routines born out of fear and necessity, keeping doors locked at all times, walking in groups, monitoring the streets and surrounding forests, and teaching children to be cautious at all times. The town had learned, through trauma, that the presence of danger was never entirely absent, and that the memory of the perpetrator's actions would continue to influence every corner of their lives, a silent and ever-present reminder of human vulnerability and the persistent threat of evil.